why don't we get started here so that we can make sure we have as much time as possible for audience questions as well. So I'll go ahead and kick us off. So, first of all, thank you everyone for tuning in to today's webinar. Earlier this month, we spoke with people living with ALS about their clinical trial experiences. Today, we happen to have a fantastic opportunity to speak with some strong ALS caregiver advocates from IMALS about their experiences with clinical trials and how clinical trial design either prevents or supports access to treatment for patients with ALS. And they'll add their specific experiences. We'll also get to hear about some of the great work that IMALS is doing to engage, educate, empower, and get patients enrolled in clinical trials quickly and efficiently. We hope some of the information that's shared today will help you and the ALS community know what to expect, provide perspective on how to select a clinical trial to participate in, and provide clinical trial sponsors with some potential improvements to clinical trial design that can benefit patients and the pace of research. I also want to say thank you to the rest of my team at Unite for working behind the scenes to make this event happen. And a special welcome and thank you to our speakers, who I'll introduce momentarily. First, a bit of background about me. My name is Tanner Dagdalen. I'm the co-founder and chief executive officer of Unite Genomics. Through the technologies that we are building at Unite, we aim to rapidly increase the research community's understanding of ALS, get more patients into trials faster, and cut years off of the discovery cycle time for researchers. We envision a world where all patients are empowered to improve their health and no patient's disease goes untreated. And to us, this world is 100% possible. And as a community, we can make it happen. So about this event, we're excited to have with us 4 amazing IMALS advocates, each with the experience of living through the ALS journey with their loved one. I have some prepared questions for our panel, but we want to answer as many audience questions as possible. So if you have a question at any time during the event, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and we'll reserve time for them at the end of the session. So now, without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. So first, we have Lori Andre. Lori serves on IMALS's clinical trials team, as well as co-chairing the community outreach team. She's also a NEALS research ambassador. Her husband, Brian, was diagnosed with ALS in fall of 2016, and although he hasn't participated in a clinical trial, he's been part of an expanded access program. Jill Bratton is our next panelist. Jill serves as a member of IMALS's community outreach, veterans, and community review teams, and is also an IMALS peer navigation program mentor. She is the founder of the Still Standing support group and on the board of Smile Inside, an organization that provides free and accessible social services to patients with ALS and their families. She's also a NEALS research ambassador, and her husband, Dave, was diagnosed with ALS in May of 2015 and lost his battle in January of 2019. During that time, despite attempts to enroll in clinical trials, Dave was not successful in qualifying for those that they applied for. Next, we have Juliet Taylor. Juliet is on the IMALS community outreach team. Her husband, Jeff, was diagnosed with ALS in November of 2018. Jeff was lucky enough to be receiving his care at a clinical trial site and was successfully able to enroll in a trial in January of 2019. After 5 months in the trial, he was eligible to receive the active drug and took it until he died peacefully at home in May of 2020. Last, but certainly not least, we have Ganesh Alangaban. Ganesh is a physician and a founder of Calidus Health, where his team focuses on simplifying and improving patient-provider communications. He's also a member of IMALS's legislative affairs and clinical trials teams. Ganesh's father, an anesthesiologist, was diagnosed with ALS in February of 2020 after experiencing his first symptoms in fall of 2019. He participated in the Healy ALS platform trial beginning in September 2020 after the T-Reg trial at Methodist was put on hold due to COVID. So thank you all for joining us today. Maybe I can just kick us off here with an initial question. when were you brought into conversations about participating in a trial? And what role did you play in that conversation? Looks like Juliet and Lori have some perspective to add here.
Sure, I'm happy to start. First of all, Tanner, thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here and get to talk about this. In our case, my husband's diagnosis was fairly quick after onset of symptoms. So when he was diagnosed, his functional rating score was still really high, and that made him eligible for. We didn't know it at the time, but that made him more eligible for trials. So because of where we were receiving care, and it happened to be a clinical trial site, we were fairly quickly steered to have that option. I'm not medical, I'm a layperson, so I didn't understand the nuances of that. And now I understand how fortunate we were to have that experience. As it turns out, his progression was really fast. So I think if we'd caught his ALS later, we probably wouldn't have had that opportunity. And what strikes me about it is just, we were fortunate just because of where we were receiving care and when we received our diagnosis. But so many ALS families, I think everyone probably listening knows ALS can be diagnosed much after onset of symptoms, and that might prevent someone from getting a chance to participate. So we happen to be fortunate just by random luck of the draw.
And so you mentioned you guys were at a clinical trial site. Did they mention other trials as well, or just the one trial that was available?
Well, I had done some homework and I knew about other trials. This happened to be one that Jeff was interested in, and it was, it was really his choice. So I personally liked it because it involved a lot of site visits. And as a new caregiver, that support felt really good to have, to see our clinical team that we loved so much and it was so helpful to us. Having the chance to go more often to clinic was sort of a deciding factor for us. So to answer your question, we were aware of other trials, but we never really seriously considered them because this one became easy for us.
How about you, Ganesh? I saw that you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, so thank you for having us, Tanner. Wonderful to be here. Since my brother's also a physician, we took a much more proactive approach where there was just a lot of basic education that we kind of put ourselves through, read up on the latest research, and then we went through a process where, being a medical family, we started off with a couple of local neurologists, so neurologists and second opinion. And I know time to diagnosis sometimes takes some time, that Julia mentioned. So we were on it pretty early, and then we were seen at Northwestern kind of as a sort of let's figure this whole thing out. But we were very proactive about reaching out. So getting him seen by, Mass General, getting him seen down at Methodist, and then COVID obviously being new right at the time of the diagnosis made everything harder. But we were very proactive about kind of seeking out the best sources of information. And then that's how we focused on Northwestern being local to us, and then being a platform trial site. That's how we ended up in the platform trial. And as I mentioned, as you mentioned, the T-reg trial unfortunately was kind of put on hold because of COVID down at Methodist. So we took the more proactive, just physician perspective of, I got to learn, I got to read, I got to reach out to the people and get answers.
Awesome. So, yeah, go ahead, Lori.
So my husband was diagnosed almost 5 years ago. And at the time when he was diagnosed, which actually took almost 2 years for his diagnosis, we were never really made aware of any clinical trials at the time. And consequently, we had a friend who knew of Chaim Leibovitz in Israel that was running this neurone trial. And they said, well, maybe, you could reach out to them and see if, you could get into that trial, which I did, which I had written a number of letters to and never got any response. But, I think it really depends like where you are in your journey and your diagnosis. So and how your ALS actually progresses. So my husband happens to be a very, very slow progressor. And even today, almost 5 years into the disease, he's still, if you were to see him today, you would not even realize that he has this disease. So we're very fortunate in that regard. And we're fortunate that where he's part of an EAP. But, there's part of me, and I think even part of the physicians might think like, okay, you're doing so well. Let's stay on this course. Why rock the boat? Why should you be enrolling now in a clinical trial this far into your disease? So I really think it depends on where you are in your disease. Although when I look back at it, I do wish upon diagnosis that we would have had this conversation with our clinicians and they would have explained to us what our options are to enroll in trials. So that's just our experience.
Awesome. Thank you, Lori. Jill, did you have something you wanted to add as well?
Yeah, I think, again, thanks for having us. My husband was a veteran, and as we all know, veterans are twice as likely to contract ALS. And when we went to the VA, of course, the VA does not do clinical trials, then there wasn't a lot of mention. And I think one thing that all of us, Juliet and Lori and Ganesh have said, it's location, it's who you know, it's, and back in 2015 when we were diagnosed, it was like reinventing the wheel. I mean, we all just studied the same stuff. We all just Googled the same stuff. That's the great thing about today. We have organizations like IMALS that has done that, and it puts you years ahead of the learning curve.
And if I can just come back to one topic that Julia, I think you brought up. You mentioned that you liked that there were multiple or many trial visits or site visits as part of the trial. Is that something that Lori, Ganesh, is that something that you guys considered, or Jill? I mean, was that a factor that you considered in looking at trials? Was how many site visits there were? The reason I ask is that we've heard from others that trial visits can be a burden if it requires travel, especially. Is that something that you guys looked at as well?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think for us, the visit thing was, it was great. His team was excellent, or is excellent. And I think our experience is a little different because we were right at kind of the startup of COVID. So the whole dynamic changed, and over the first few months, it was in-person visits every month, and then after that, I think 3 months into the trial, they gave us like a home spirometer, and then they gave us like, hey, we can send the home health nurse out to your house to draw labs. So I think there was a little different situation with COVID for us. Now, I think for a lot of patients, there's definitely a burden or a difficulty in getting people transported, especially once disease starts progressing. So in my mind, there's an ideal blend of what's convenient for the patient family and what is necessary for the trial. And I think if patients have more choice on which way to lean, I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, I think that location is a big consideration in general. We know that where most of the trial sites are, they're in major, or at least near major metropolitan areas. But one thing that really needs to be considered is there's a lot of people in the middle of the country, for example, that don't have access. And that is something that I think will definitely needs to be addressed, is that there's an underserved community right now of people that don't have the accessibility to these trial sites. And that's why doing things remotely, the use of technology, these are all things that really need to be looked at and incorporated into clinical trials so that we do have, and we are able to enroll a more diverse population as well, for the sake of science and also for the sake of the patient.
One of the clinical trials that we applied for was in a different region of the country. And we went as far and looked into temporary housing for 6 months to live out there, which at the time would have been quite a burden, but we were willing to do it. So, and I think there are a lot of patients that are willing to do that. So I think Lori has a really valid point that the more we can get locations closer to the part of the country that is just not served as well would be hugely helpful.
Wow.
And I should clarify that we lived 40 minutes from the site. So for us, it was not a travel burden, but I can appreciate that that it would be had we not been nearby. And it would have been a factor, frankly.
Yeah. So as you look back on how you evaluated different trials, do you have any lessons learned or things that you would have done differently?
I mean, I think one, just to take off on what Lori mentioned as far as the accessibility before I answer that question, is from the physician perspective, I think one of the biggest things I wish a lot of the trial sponsors and the companies were doing more of is educating the general neurologists out there to be more aware. And just a very simple example, there's a reasonably close friend of mine through my network here where I live. And, she is probably about a year into symptoms. She has been told it might be ALS, but I've been encouraging her to get seen at one of the large centers where, she can, she's still got good functional status. She would be eligible for a lot more early on. But I think the more general physicians get educated, neurologists that see these people, I mean, I think they're a bridge to access. The more that they know and the more they can direct patients, I think the more help they can be to just kind of get the ball rolling. So, and then just in terms of, for us with COVID, trials slowed down. So we had our kind of mindset on T-reg trial is kind of like our number one. And then we were looking at, okay, platform trials kind of rolling out pretty soon. We did look at a lot of other trials and spoke to, different physicians. But, I think the platform trial design was definitely attractive because it was much more patient friendly, much more, clinician controlled. And I think those were positives. But for us, there wasn't really a whole lot of choices, especially with COVID kind of starting to drive a lot of the situational needs.
Yeah, and if I can just piggyback on what Ganesh is saying, is that there's just such a lack of awareness, not only on the patient's part, but also on the clinician's part. And I think that, for people who live in communities where there's not a major ALS clinic, they'll go and see a neurologist, and this neurologist might not have had even seen any patients with ALS. So I think it's really imperative and prudent for patients to, upon diagnosis, to be able to have access to some of the leading, clinical, some of the research facilities where there are physicians and clinicians who are researchers and physicians to help guide the process, which unfortunately, there's just, some people just don't have those resources. But more importantly, it comes down to education and awareness, but not just on the patient's part, but also on the clinician's part too.
Tanner, I just want to say too that when you're first diagnosed with ALS, it's so important to be able to access this type of research. But as a caregiver and as a patient, you're overwhelmed. And it seems like you've just turned over the hourglass and you're watching the sand slip through there so quickly that it takes a while. So that's why it's nice to have a resource of some kind to go to and say, okay, this is a road we need to start on.
That's a very good point that Jill makes. I think in a regular daily life where you're not dealing with ALS, it makes sense that you would do all this homework and investigation and be super organized about it. But when you get that diagnosis, there's so many things you're worried about from every sense of your loved one's well-being. And finding a trial, if you decide to go that route, is just one of them. You're also thinking about mobility. You're thinking about, quality of life, all these other things. And so you're maybe not, in my case, I wouldn't have been approaching it with my best organizational skills. The navigation would have been really hard had we not been fortunate enough to be in the position that we just were lucky enough to be at a site.
Yeah, maybe we can pause on that topic for a minute here. So, what are some of the things for those in the audience who are considering clinical trials and that sort of thing? What were some of the things you had to manage during the application and enrollment process? We heard last week that some of you had to produce medical records, sometimes in a very short amount of time. What sort of factors should people be prepared for as they can consider starting the process of applying for trials and trying to find one that could work?
When we were looking for clinical trials, my husband Dave would always say it was the worst dating app he's ever had to be on, because you're trying to impress people, you're trying to tell them you want to be part of it, you're trying to supply them with everything they need, but at the same time, facts are facts medically. If you don't work into the scenario they need, if you're been diagnosed or onset symptoms is more than 2, sometimes 3 years, you're out. If your age is above a certain number, you're out. If your breathing is below a certain number, you're out. In our case, early on, Dave wanted to take some supplements that he had looked into and really thought they would help. And because of that, it put him out of a couple of the trials. So I would say that, it's a very delicate balance, and it's a very fine line that you walk to find the right trial.
I would just kind of add sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Ganesh.
I would add a couple things, and I think this to me is extremely important being a physician, is I think as a patient, you need to find the right doctor, because they're going to be your kind of like, helmsman during the whole process. And really you want to have that team that you engage with. What I wouldn't like to see is, be in a situation where you're in a trial just to be in a trial, but you're kind of gritting your teeth, and maybe the, doctor that you have or the team that you have isn't the team that you want. To me, that's really important, that, this is a long-term process, and you don't want to look at it as a sort of a temporary, I need to deal with this person for, 6 months or something while I'm in the trial, because I don't think that's going to be a good impact on the patient or the family. So that was one of the things that, I would just say is very important. And in terms of the process, I mean, there was, for us, there was, TUDCA is one of the supplements that is often used for ALS patients. So there was a washout period of 30 days. So again, I think it was the trial, Healy platform trial was friendly, patient-friendly design. There's a washout period for a couple of the supplements, and there's a decision-making process, right? It's, am I going to be giving up something to potentially be on placebo for 6 months, or maybe I get active agent, does the agent work? So I think there's no one size fits all, but those sorts of things, I would be looking for protocols that are more friendly. And then you've got good clinician team to really support you during that whole process. No matter, you're not going to be afraid to tell them, look, I'm done with the trial. I'm not doing well on this. That should be a very open conversation. You should never be in a position that is something you're afraid to bring up.
Yeah, I think Ganesh brings up a really good point. When my husband was diagnosed, we basically decided to do a nationwide tour of all of the leading ALS clinics and institutions. And we were fortunate that we had the resources to do that. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that don't have those resources. But my feeling was that we really, not only do we need to advocate for ourselves, but we really needed to find a physician that was going to advocate for us, because as Jill said, you get this diagnosis, it's so daunting. You have no idea, the first thing you do is you go to Google and you start looking at all, these different articles, and it's very scary. So, we really made a plan that we needed to find a clinician that was really, really going to advocate for us, which we did, which thankfully, we still have this amazing relationship with her. It happens to be that it's not in the city of Chicago, but it is in Boston. And while we're still able to go to Boston and travel, we're lucky. But the other thing is what we have to also consider is that we wanted a physician that was going to be accessible. And that is really, really important in this disease because things come up, you have so many questions on a daily basis and you want answers. You don't want to have to wait. You don't want to have to go through a portal. So I think, again, it's really making the right choice right from the start, is finding that clinician who is going to be your advocate.
And, if we can dive in a little deeper on this topic for a second here, for patients and family members, caregivers who maybe don't have the resources or ability to do kind of a tour and really get to know a lot of physicians, how would you recommend going about finding the right expert who's going to be an advocate, who's going to be accessible, who's obviously very knowledgeable, has seen many ALS patients before, that sort of?
So to kind of touch on what Lori had said before about accessibility, I think especially with telemedicine having kind of, really been center stage during COVID and ramping, we're also continually seen up at Mass General as well. And we have, monthly or, every 6-week visits telemedicine wise with our doctor up at MGH. So I think with the technology enablement now, patients have a little more freedom and ability to go set up appointments and go do telemedicine visits. So I really encourage people to take full advantage of that. And I think the only state that I can mention that's a little weird in that sense was we got seen at Methodist in person down in Houston because the state of Texas just has weird telemedicine state medical board laws. So we actually went down to Houston kind of height of COVID summer of last year. But outside of that, it's been really useful to have the technology modes to be able to access clinicians. So, I think that's an option that people should definitely take advantage of.
Yeah, I agree. I think also the ALS community is a really powerful community in terms of support for people who are recently diagnosed. Unfortunately, I wasn't part of that community because when Brian was first diagnosed. But since I've been in the fight for the last almost 5 years, what I've noticed is I'm very vocal with our story and the advocacy work we're doing in the community, that people will often ask me questions who are newly diagnosed as a patient advocate. What should I do? What are the first steps? Where should I go? Who should I be seeing? Are there trials? And I've actually helped a number of people when they were first diagnosed to kind of put them in the right direction. In fact, Mark Litt was on your panel last week, and through word of mouth, they contacted me knowing that I was an advocate for ALS and if I had any thoughts or ideas of where he should be seen or what trials. And so I think that we can never underestimate the voice of this community and the advocacy work that we're doing that is really bringing good to this community and helping people when they're first diagnosed. So I think we need to continue doing this great advocacy work to help people on their journey when they're first diagnosed.
Sometimes I feel like Dave was diagnosed back in 2015, and I feel like that was the dark ages because we've come so far in just 6 years. It's amazing to me. When he was first diagnosed, we were Googling and looking, and we made a phone call to ALS TDI because we didn't know where else to turn. And they did a phenomenal job of navigating things for us, giving us information. And so I would kind of say the same thing. I hate to keep repeating myself, but it's worth it because it's a phenomenal organization. ALS has a great navigational team, and they are happy to point you in the right direction. As Lori said, anyone that you see on social media that is part of ALS or part of an ALS organization is going to be on your side and help you in any way they can, really.
And
I wanted
you
to
know, if
add
we
a
can,
point too
oh,
that
please go ahead, Julia.
we were very lucky in that our primary care physician took an interest in Jeff's general well-being and health. So even though we were being seen for his ALS, we were also being seen for his overall well-being, and we had the same doctor. And so having a primary care physician that for both of us, for the whole family, that understood what we were going through on a different scale was also, he was part of our team. He stayed up to date on Jeff's ALS care, and that made a big difference.
And sorry, Tanner, just to take off on what Juliet said and a little bit of what Lori said. I think especially for people that are a little further away from maybe their trial center, it's also really important to have the physician locally that is collaborative and they want to work with your neurologist, your trial team, at the center, and coordinate things, because it's not just the ALS, right? You're still a human being with medical issues, and you need regular care as well. So I think the better relationship people, or the better collaboration people you can find locally, really helps out a lot when they're like, hey, yeah, I don't know about ALS that much, and I'm going to work with your pulmonologist, your neurologist, et cetera. I think that's hugely important.
And I think almost I think 3 out of 4 panelists here on the call even had experiences being ineligible for these clinical trials for one reason or another, which speaks to the importance of expanded access programs. And I think it's right now a hot topic. It's on everyone's mind. But for those who are maybe new to the ALS journey, can somebody describe what an expanded access program is? And I think Lori, it would be great to hear your experience as well with the expanded access program in particular.
So Brian is part of an expanded access program at Mass General. He's been on it now for almost 2 years. And actually, as it turns out, now they're actually running a trial for this drug in Europe, not in the US, but in Europe. So he tolerates it really well. Of course, like anything else, we don't know if this is what's helping him. It could just be his course. Because of the nature of ALS, you don't really know what is working and what's not working. But it's certainly a good way to collect good data, which they do. They follow him. And to your point, EAP is definitely a hot topic right now. And we are pushing, obviously, for every trial to have open label extension and EAPs.
If I can jump on my soapbox a little bit here, Tanner. When Dave was diagnosed, they thought he was a slow progressor. And in ALS, you can appear to be a slow progressor, or at least in our case. Obviously, everyone is different, and I have no medical experience at all, just my own story. And, he was going along fine until unexpectedly he was gone. So I just feel like EAP is such a vital thing. When you don't qualify, you're not a fast progressor, you're not meeting the standards they want to see. But you know what? ALS is working inside your body the whole time, and you never know what's going to happen. So anyone can benefit from it.
And I think on the EAP note, we were literally just finished up our 6-month platform trial on March 4th. And then, other things happened. But just from the panel here, you have Lori's husband who is slower progressing, right? You have my dad who, went from practicing September of 2019 to, wheelchair June of 2020. So I think when you just look at even the panel, there's such heterogeneity that the EAP is so important, because some of the, pulmonary function, the SVC cutoffs are like 70% for some of the trials, which is, that's a very high bar, especially for somebody who's even maybe like 3 months or 6 months in the diagnosis. And I think especially with like the biomarkers and all these other data points now that people are gathering, probably, to kind of some of the stuff that Unite does. Now that there's more data capture capability, I think EAPs make even more sense to include that heterogeneous population, because I think everybody can bring value to the equation.
And, so I guess, Lori, this is a question for you. When did the EAP conversation come up? Was it upon being screened out, or did you bring it up to them, or, how can people in the community get that started?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good conversation to have with your clinician. Again, we're very fortunate that we have an amazing clinician at Mass General, and it was brought up to us. I think it's just, the problem with EAP is actually the availability of the drug and making sure that these sponsors actually produce enough drug for the EAP. In our case, our physician just said, I have this access to this EAP that I think, Brian would be definitely eligible for. Why don't we try it? And of course we said yes, because, with ALS, we'll just throw anything at it, and see what works. But again, I think it really depends on who your clinician is and whether or not they're have the access to the drug, if they're working with the drug sponsors. I'm not sure how it actually works between the clinic and the drug sponsor, but in our case, it did become available, and of course we opted to do it.
So in your case, it was your clinician brought it up.
Yes, our clinician brought it up. Yeah. And you have to think about it for people who are diagnosed also, Tanner. This is like, when you're first diagnosed, you're not even aware of what these terms mean. You don't know what an EAP is. You don't know what an OLE is. You don't really have a concept of what is a clinical trial for treatment, or is it for research purposes? So I think, again, it goes back to this whole piece of really educating yourself so that you can have these conversations with your clinician, and advocate for yourself.
And, it occurs to me that we actually didn't define what an EAP is here for anybody who maybe is unaware in the audience. But the short version is that, expanded access programs are to an opportunity to provide drug to patients who don't qualify, meet the qualifying criteria for the trial. And so the reason it's in the news right now, I think, I'm safe in saying that it's the Biogen story that really kind of took at least the US by storm. So has anyone brought up an expanded access program or the opportunity to participate in an expanded access program with their physician, kind of unprompted, now that, it's on everyone's mind?
Yeah, so that was definitely part of the initial conversation. And I literally knew one page from a textbook about ALS because it's not a neurosurgical condition, but I learned a lot quickly. So that was part of the initial discussion. And at that point, at least in the platform trial, there wasn't expanded access set up yet because it was just starting to enroll at Northwestern, and it was very early on. So timeline wise, we didn't kind of fit into a place that we asked, and we keep asking about kind of what's available, but we definitely brought it up proactively, though in our case it was a little different with qualifying for the trial.
Got it. And just a reminder to everyone in the audience, if you have questions to submit, go ahead and use the Q&A feature and submit your questions, and we'll make sure to get them answered live here. So I have another question for us here, which is, we talked about a lot of different things already, but if you had, one piece of advice for caregivers who are looking for trials with their patient with ALS or weighing the options but have not yet enrolled, what would that piece of advice be, or maybe a resource to send them to? I know ALS has a lot of resources in particular, and I think educating the community about what's available is very important.
I'll just make 2 points, just to underscore what Jill said, and it's not just because we're all part of IMALS, but it really truly is an amazing organization that really puts the person living with ALS and their family at the center, and all of us involved, just about all of us involved, are patients and families, and just want to help others going through the same thing. So that's a great place to start. The piece of advice that I would give is just to keep in mind, as Ganesh said, the heterogeneity of the disease. It's very easy when you're living with ALS in your family to make comparisons about how your loved one is doing versus somebody else, and that's not helpful in any way. You just have to live your own life and manage your own situation with ALS, and not get too hung up on what's happening with others, how their disease is progressing. It's just different in every case.
I think if I was going to give one piece of advice, it would be probably along the same lines as Ganesh had said earlier, and that is you may have to push your neurologist a little bit, and you may have to say, tell me where I go from here. Tell me what I do. I mean, again, we were seen at the VA, and they were incredible. And our neurologist was behind us 100% and said she would do anything that she could. So even though they may not have the connections, they can reach out to other things and point you in the right direction. And I think that's vital. Like Lori said, you have to be your own advocate.
And I would add two things. One is don't wait. So I would, the faster you start doing the homework and the faster you start figuring out where you could go and what the options are, the more stuff you're going to be eligible for. So you don't want to put that off. It's hard because you're in a very, new, challenging position, but you just want to be very, good about doing your homework and making things happen. And then the second thing I would say is to Juliet's point is, don't reinvent the wheel. Find people that can help you, that have gone through the process or are part of our organization, whether it's a local chapter or whether it's IMALS. They're just going to be a really great resource, because I'll tell you, having gone through the invent the wheel process myself and with the family, with a lot of guidance from my network of physician colleagues, there's a lot of stuff that IMALS could have really helped with if I had looked early on, just to understand what was out there and the people willing to help.
And if we can kind of tie this topic with a previous one, the average ALS patient or caregiver with caring for somebody with ALS may not know about expanded access programs and what they mean and how to get access to them and that sort of thing. So is there work underway right now that you can point people to get educated about expanded access programs and how to make the most use of them?
Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of EAPs, and simply because there's just not enough money for funding these EAPs, there's not enough drug being produced, especially for some of these small pharma companies. We're lucky with the platform trial that there is an EAP. Unfortunately, not everybody who is excluded from the trial will have access to the EAP. So again, I think it's just like educating yourself around the fact that there are other options and there are conversations to have with your clinicians about other choices. So maybe you couldn't get into the Healy trial, but there are other trials that are available that don't have the same exclusions, or that they don't have the placebo, or there is an open label. So again, I think part of it is just really making yourself aware and having these discussions with your clinician and pushing them, like I think Ganesh said, is to really push them and, have these conversations with them and explore what the other possibilities are, because not everyone can have access to an EAP.
And I would just say one additional thing to what Lori said is, just from the panel, I mean, you're a patient that's looking, or a family that's looking, when they tap into an IMALS or an ALS, organization chapter, they're going to be tapping into the collective knowledge and help of the chapter, where a lot of those patients are already going to be. They're going to tell you, hey, here's the latest at Northwestern, here's the latest at MGH, here's the latest at Methodist. We're in this, or I talked to my doctor last week. I think those are tremendously valuable resources where, you're just getting straight answers from people that are actually talking to these folks, which for us is really important. I don't like bureaucracy or layers. It was straight to, I want to talk to, Merritt up at MGH. I want to talk to Dr. Appel down at Methodist. I want to talk to so-and-so. So I think tap it in that network, take advantage of us, because amongst the network, you're going to be talking to people that are being seen at the top centers and can give you insight as to what the latest is there.
It seems to be a theme throughout this whole conversation. Let us do the legwork for you, because we did the legwork for ourselves, and we don't want you to have to do the legwork all over again. So reach out and we'll be happy to share everything we know.
And, if we can flip it around, for the trial sponsors who are tuning in right now and those who will watch online later on, what advice or comment do you have for trial sponsors? What factors should they keep in mind while designing their trials?
I'll kind of jump on that one. So I'll kind of take it from two perspectives. I'm definitely coming at this from the physician and scientist perspective. So, data capture is important, power of study is important. I mean, those are all unquestionably important, valuable things. But, I was just looking through the masitinib trial, which is enrolling at Northwestern right now. It actually started, I think, a month and a half ago or so. I'm going through the trial protocol with the neurologist, and it's very daunting. And I think there's something like more than monthly EKGs and a whole bunch of lab work and stuff. And I mean, those are important things, but I think the trial designers and the companies have to keep perspective on balancing what we need with what is real world feasible, because these aren't people that you keep in the hospital forever during the trial that you have access to 24/7 to do whatever you want to. So I think COVID forced the situation for things like some of the home health visits, to be able to do blood draws, to be able to do EKGs. I think not losing that momentum and having sponsors look at these tools that have started to become more utilized is something that should definitely continue. And they should design that into, okay, wait, maybe we don't need this month's visit because we can get an EKG at home, we can do home spirometry, and the nurse can do the labs. And I didn't really ask themselves the question for a particular visit, just make sure there's high value for the patient coming in for the visit. And if there isn't, try to skew towards patient convenience. Because that's also going to get your enrollment up in terms of people saying, hey, there's some options here, and it's not always going to be, an hour and a half drive to Chicago to do this and this and this, which for us was not, anything we even worried about, but that's not easy for all patients. And especially the consideration of ALS progression. A patient might start off walking into the trial, and, they may not be walking into the trial 6 months in. So you have to think about this in trial design, that a starting point of a patient may not be their ending point, or at some point they progress and then it becomes harder. So you have to think about that.
Did anybody want to add something to what Ganesh just said?
I would just say, and I think Ganesh is saying this also, include advocates in your design. Come to the people who have been through it, or patients even, and talk to them, take some advice from them. There's no one better than the people that are in it or have been in it.
Yeah, and if I can just add, the patient voice is just so powerful, and the sponsors have to look at it that we can help them. We can help them enroll their trials if they are patient-centric, if they are offering us better trial designs and get patients talking about it, more likely the trials will enroll. I think that the Healy platform trial has done a really, really good job because they're completely transparent. They're working with the patient, they're educating the patients, they're doing the weekly webinars, and then people start talking about it. I mean, the Healy platform trial has enrolled 4 times faster than any other trial. And that's because of the way they've collaborated with the patient population. And if we could just follow that lead and use them as a model, I think it'd be a win-win, not only for the sponsors, the researchers, but also for the patients. So more information, more transparency, more patient-centric, patient-friendly trial design is key. They almost have to like think of us as sort of like to think differently, like we're the consumer and they need to offer us the best customer service possible.
And the one thing I would add to that is, you know, the information at the start of the platform trial. So, you know, all the waivers and like, here's the, you know, protocol, here's the thing. I mean, I think they did a much better job than I've seen from other trials in terms of making some of the information more digestible for patients, like the average patient and the family. And I think that's another, it's not part of trial design necessarily, but the more the sponsor or the drug company can just think through, hey, you know, how can we simplify a little roadmap here for the patient, just so they can understand, here's the process, break it down into understandable bits and pieces, and something that just makes it easier for them to comprehend. It's not part of the trial itself, but I think that's something that helps patients make decisions easier, to understand what's going on.
Yeah, I think language is really important, definitely. There seems to be a lack of plain language for the people who are not clinicians or, you know, healthcare professionals. So yeah, I agree with Ganesh wholeheartedly.
Awesome. Well, any last topics that we want to cover here before I close things out? And I'm going to mention, I reserved some time at the end. I'm going to mention a few different ALS programs that we know to be absolutely fantastic as resources for the community. And so I'll touch on those in just a minute. But any other discussion topics we wanted to cover here?
I think it's really important that patients share their stories when it comes to clinical trials. I really do. Whether they're good or bad, I think the more people hear about it, the more we have a conversation about it, the more we sort of bring more light to it, I think is really, really important. And of course, our end goal is to enroll more patients.
Yeah.
And I think on that,
just
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ganesh.
Oh, so the one thing I would add to that is try to find when you talk to patients and you talk to these groups, right? I mean, I think part of what they also help you with is finding the right doctor, you know, because it's a small community. And I think the patient experiences and the family experiences are another, just not even part of the trial, just finding the right doctor. So I would say that's very important to look at too.
Agreed.
I wanted to share that I think probably more for the sponsors than anyone else, but participating in a trial was something my husband was really proud of. He took the trial drug until the day he passed. It was something he felt really strongly about and really good about in terms of contributing back to finding cures. So just keep that in mind, that it's a really profound, it can be a really profound experience for the patient and their family.
And I'll just say that if you are newly diagnosed, if you are a ALS patient, or if you are a caregiver, don't get overwhelmed, because there are a lot of resources out there, and there's a whole community that is willing to help in any way they can. It's an overwhelming diagnosis. We all know that, but we all have waded through it, and you can do that too. And we're happy to help in any way we can.
Awesome. And with that, you know, thank you all again for joining us, and a very special thank you to our panelists here, and I Am ALS as an organization who is co-hosting today's event. I Am ALS has some incredible programs to support and guide those in the ALS community, as we all know. 2 of those programs are their navigation program and their clinical research dashboard. So the navigation program provides one-on-one personalized assistance and connects people impacted by ALS to the resources that they need. This can include assistance in learning about and connecting to clinical trials in the US as well. To get help from IMALS, you can go to imals.org/reach-out. IMALS also has a clinical research dashboard called ALS Signal, which was designed for and by patients and caregivers. And this tool provides people with an overview of treatments and supplements that are being tested right now. So to explore this tool, you can go to imals.org/ALS Signal. So please look out for a post-event evaluation form in your emails. We would appreciate it if you could complete it to help us improve these events in the future. We appreciate everyone's support and look forward to seeing what we can accomplish as a community in advancing ALS research and treatments in 2021. We heard a lot of things today, but with all of it, as always, the time to act is now. So let's get out there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.